Good evening. Today we are going to look at Etruscan identity, specifically looking at cultural relativity and ethnocentrism, and what these ideas mean in relation to the Etruscan identity, the identity of the Etruscan civilization. My name is Gabriel Gilbert. I am currently a senior in the Commonwealth Governor's School at North Stafford High School, and I selected the Etruscans for my culminating project to finish out my time in the CGS program as my final research. Firstly, just a brief overview of my research and the question that really drove and propelled my entire motivation for completing this culminating project. The question that drove my research was how did Roman and Greek authors frame the perception of Etruscan civilization via literature over time? What this means is that I'm looking specifically at literary sources. I'm looking at the writings of the Romans and the Greeks in order to construct a purposefully tinted image of Etruscan civilization, specifically what the Romans and Greeks thought of the Etruscans and how they changed what many people saw of the Etruscans over time. The time period I'm looking at is the early Roman Republic all the way to the beginning of the Julio-Claudian reign. So really just the founding of the Republic to the early imperial period, looking at just the dawn of the Julio-Claudians. So really just Golden Age Latin literature. This is the time frame I selected in order to provide a concise yet effective way of documenting all of the available authors that spoke in the Etruscans in order to build as really varied a viewpoint as possible. Considering the limited availability of classical authors, this time period is perfect for looking at the Etruscans when they remained truly relevant to political and cultural discussion. Now, who were the Etruscans? The Etruscans were an Italian civilization that resided in present-day Tuscany, from which really the name Tuscany is derived from. It's from the Etruscans, who were overlords of the Romans turned subordinates around the year 400 BC. The dates, while not entirely certain, are really indicative of a time period where the Etruscans used to be really the superior civilization and martial power in northern Italy. At a certain point in time, the tides changed, and the Romans would eventually gain sovereignty and truly became the overlords of Italy. But for a long period of time, specifically looking at the years prior to 400 BC, the Etruscan League was a powerhouse. And really, I'm looking at the transformation of a perspective by the Romans to the Etruscans, who really were in many ways their cultural forebears. What is ethnocentrism? According to Merriam-Webster and many renowned sociologists and anthropologists, it is the belief in the superiority of one's own ethnic group or culture. This is the idea, when looking at my project specifically, that Romans believed they were superior, Greeks believed they were superior in relation to themselves and in comparison to the Etruscans. Now, my rationale for choosing this project really was because of my large interest in the Etruscan civilization as it was. As I was reading Livy and Virgil, learning about this specific culture that resided in the same place as the Romans, who provided so much to Roman culture, yet weren't talked about in standard curriculum, really wanted me to it really drove me to just ask these questions. I was truly interested because in learning about Roman history, I was surprised to know that there was a time, obviously, that the Romans weren't superior, but that a civilization so renowned and so unique, speaking a language that isn't classified as Indo-European, was responsible for bequeathing such a diverse cultural legacy. It was this that really drove my research and really inspired me to continue forth with it for an entire year. They really are just a link between Rome and Greece and contributed greatly to Italian culture and the founding of Rome. Now, my expert was Dr. Liane Hotelin. She is a professor at the University of Mary Washington in the Classics Department and a member of several professional organizations in regard to classical studies. She really helped guide my research and tailor my approach in order to look at concise time periods and remember and reminded me actually to look at the biases of certain authors in order to make sure that I'm providing as objective a viewpoint as possible. Now, the methodology for my research. For ethnocentrism, and these are the three categories I chose, I looked at classical documents that revealed the perspective of writers and their depiction of Etruscan civilization. For Etruscan culture, I looked at primary accounts of Etruscan civilization and or culture with special regard to distinct characteristics, again from authors that lived during a time period where the Etruscans remained culturally relevant. In addition, I looked at comparative identity, which was just really the comparison of these two identities and its change over time, if possible, demonstrated through literature and just chronological construction of these authors in a given timeline. The final product of my research was a research paper on Etruscan identity, something that looked at this cultural relativity and ethnocentrism as focuses of research and looked at these primary sources in order to construct a varied perspective, and something that answered a few of my questions in regard to how these authors really framed Etruscan discussion. The primary sources that I looked at consisted of varied sources, some from Appian, Hesiod, Livy, Polybius, Sophocles, and Strabo, along with their books and novels. A lot of these translations were provided by the Medusa Digital Library by the University of Chicago, in addition to the Perseus Digital Library provided by Tufts University. Firstly, the category I looked at was ethnocentrism. Now, the Etruscans, despite providing a foundation for Roman culture, would eventually become politically subservient and assimilated into Roman society via a process we call Romanization. The Etruscans were really, in many ways, pioneers in their field. They created a lot of the basis of art and murals and offered a lot of that early prototypical Roman culture that would eventually become very famous in the Renaissance and later. In fact, it's interesting to know that because despite the Etruscans providing this, they aren't mentioned or praised for their ability to share this with Rome. In fact, they're often isolated. The critique that many classical authors, and specifically Romans, had pertained to three categories, which I'll look at here. Firstly, socially. Both the Romans and Greeks were critical of how liberal and promiscuous Etruscan women seemed. It really was a question regarding just how Etruscan women operated. They operated with a liberality that wasn't afforded to the Roman and Greek women. The Rape of Lucretia and its varied perspective really offers a lot of insight into how Etruscan women were viewed. Contemporary scholars actually look at this instance as a way for Romans to sort of instill virtue into Lucretia, despite the fact that she was very possibly an Etruscan wife. And instead, she is given a Roman personality that aligns with Roman viewpoints, despite the fact that, again, that this wife was likely an Etruscan. So it's really just a perfect nexus that I'll look at later in order to offer just a very singular insight into this ethnocentrism. Politically, the Roman Republic differed from the Confederacy of Etruscan cities, but it is actually said of some classical authors and contemporary scholars that the Etruscans that lived in Rome and that were later assimilated into Roman society were just as fearful of a king as the Romans were. This Rexophobia, if you will, was something that the Romans held very close to their heart following the regal period. And yet, these Etruscans, who would seem so different, and in fact, the last three kings of Rome were indeed Etruscans, actually, even despite this difference, there was just a very stark observation of mine in that despite having a different governmental structure, they shared this fear of a king. It is therefore even more interesting that there were areas of critique for the Romans. Economically, there's not too much known about the socio-economic spectrum, but it reveals that poetry and classical authors reveal that the Romans affiliated the Etruscans with decadence and excess, in contrast to that Roman Spartanesque lifestyle of just plainness and lack of this ornate. Of course, we know that the Romans are ornate, but there was just an affiliation that both the Greeks and Romans had with the Etruscans with decadence. Now, in regard to Etruscan culture and what we know, half of Rome's kings, almost half of them, were Etruscan, and Etruscan metallurgy actually predated the Romans. Rome was actually a vassal of Etruria at different points, and you actually see figures like Lars Porsena making great martial strides into Rome, and of course, these Etruscans just had the upper hand in many cases. They're actually an ally. In fact, if you look at Plutarch's retelling of Camillus and his story, it's actually known that the city of Clusium appealed to the Romans for help against the invasion of Brennus and the Gauls. So you see a time period where these people were on friendly relations, but this contrasts strongly with the later instances of critique. There's an active distinction made by multiple authors. Just a few examples here. I have Appian, who refers to the Etruscans plainly as others. I have Livy, who does link the Etruscans to Rome via the kingship, but does not share in the idea of a continuity from Etruscan civilization to Rome. He makes this active distinction between Rome and Etruria, despite this Roman dialogue. Plutarch, again, about the Clusium example, and Dionysius of Halicarnassus makes a distinction between the Pelasgians, who were known as the Sea Peoples, and the Tyrrhenians or Etruscans. One, the Greeks before Dionysius, he says, do not. The third category I looked at was comparative identity, just the comparison of what the Greeks and Romans believed of themselves and what they believed of the Etruscans in relation to themselves. The Etruscans were a confederacy via the Etruscan League, so you had many independent cities working a lot like the Greeks, um, but not united by a centralized monarch. There was actually lesser gender disparity from a social standpoint, and they had unique religious aspects like haruspicy that really made them culturally and religiously distinct, despite them sharing deities from the Greek religion that many believe of contemporary scholars they would later share to the Romans. It is also known that they were not expansionists in a way. They really primarily stayed in their area, the areas of the Etruscan League or the Etruscan Empire, as some primary sources reveal, and weren't as expansionist as Rome was. It's hard to find a comparison to Rome, but you see between the Greeks and Romans figures like Alexander the Great and others that would come to this expansionist idea, this Hellenistic conquest. The Romans would obviously keep that trend, but the Etruscans, you don't see that. You see a much more culturally oriented civilization. This isn't to say that the Greeks and Romans weren't culturally oriented, they just did not have it as a priority that was as scaled as the Etruscans, I would say. You also see, of course, the direct democracy among the Greeks and Romans, which isn't as well known. I could not find definitive sources that affirmed the idea of direct democracy in Etruria, but yeah, it was just an interesting point of contrast between the two peoples. Now, the one instance I would really like to look at is the myth of Lucretia, and this is something that Professor Hall wrote about a bit extensively in some of the research I looked at. Lucretia was raped by Sextus Tarquinius, the son of the last king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus. Her husband, Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, would later work with Brutus and lead the charge against the Tarquins, exiling them from Rome, and eventually founding a republic. This fear of the Etruscan kings would lead to Romans fearing the word king. In fact, even Augustus would not call himself a king. It was sort of this humility that would lead to more titles, and the accumulation of many titles that would lead to that position of emperor, sort of de facto. There was a fear of the word king, but for the sake of my research, the myth of Lucretia offers some interesting insight into what people believed about Roman women and Etruscan women in comparison. What we know from primary sources and what scholars have come to a consensus today is that Etruscan women had a degree of freedom that their Roman and Greek counterparts did not. They were allowed to associate freely with men that were not their husband. In fact, nudity was very commonplace, so you had figures working almost very openly with it. Was a very much more open society in comparison to Roman Greece, and this was a point of criticism by both the Greeks and Romans, who viewed this practice of nudity as somewhat barbaric. But it's interesting to see that Lucretia is always written about in primary sources as a very virtuous maiden. She was chaste and pure, and these Etruscans came in, raped her against her will, and in doing so would later trigger the founding of the Republic. But it's not known what truly happened, of course, and we only have the primary sources to believe. But this shift in perspective, this contrast between what we can believe to be reality and what is documented in the literature, demonstrates just sort of a very willing viewpoint of the Romans to allow themselves, while putting the Etruscans on a lower part of the pedestal. It allows them to just take into their own hands the perspective of women and alter it to favor Rome and not Etruria, despite the fact that this simply isn't seen historically to be the case. Now, just my conclusions and major takeaways. The Etruscans, in my research, bequeathed a cultural legacy to Rome, and authors don't disagree on this. They indirectly aided the establishment of the Roman Republic, considering Tarquinius Superbus and just his general tenacity and the tension he provoked among the Romans. There was a clear difference between Roman and Greek literary depiction. Romans seem to be very ethnocentric. They seem to constantly take a patriotic approach to Rome, primarily because there seems to be, once again, that proximity that wasn't quite shared with the Greeks. The Greeks criticized many aspects of Etruscan culture, but you don't see something that really purposefully put the Greeks in a better light in a specific comparison with the Etruscan civilization. Additionally, it was fascinating to learn that the Etruscan writing system was the basis for the Romans, the Old Italic script. And really, that's what Western civilization uses today, which makes it almost more important to know about the Etruscans and primarily the purpose for my research. It also appears that there does seem to be a gradual shift to forgetting the Etruscans, where the sources sort of die out during this process known as Romanization, and there is an eventual fade to obscurity. My thesis, thus, is that there is a clearly critical orientation of the Etruscans as a disparate culture by Roman and Greek authors from the time period that I chose. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I appreciate your willingness to watch and learn. It has been an absolute pleasure learning about the Etruscans and reading about them and hearing what scholarly discourse exists today about them. I hope you have a fantastic day. Once again, thank you and good night.